Summer with the Marine, Chapter 2, Ford. Ford sensed someone approaching from behind. He'd have sat with his back to the wall, but the walls were mostly windows at the restaurant, so he angled himself the best he could to get a view of the open air and ocean along with the dining room. His muscles tensed as the floorboards creaked at his back. "Dude, you're a civilian now. It's okay," he murmured. Ford's discharge officer had suggested, and since he was senior to him, suggest was all he could do, that the Marine see a counselor for a few weeks as he integrated back into society. The counselor had suggested Ford put himself in situations that were mildly uncomfortable to prove to himself that he was safe and didn't have to always be on high alert. It was a way to retrain his mind so he could relax after serving in the military for over a decade. He owed it to Coco and to anyone who had the unfortunate experience of crossing his path if he was zone ready, as the infantry unit called it. He also practiced a few of the cleansing breaths the counselor had taught him. Previously, his life had been organized, regimented, and strategic. Recently, it had turned random, chaotic, and a battle to stay awake after a few long nights of teething. Ford sighed, scrubbed his hand over his face, and sat up straight as the waitress reached the table. "I'm supposed to ask you on a date," she blurted. At those words, and the familiar-sounding voice, a jolt of shock rushed through him, but his face remained an impassive plane. Ford hadn't yet retrained himself to express emotion. Eisley Higgins stood in front of him with a black apron tied around her waist and her dirty blonde hair hanging to her shoulders. Dark eye makeup circled her honey-brown eyes and her lips were stained a faint pink. Her t-shirt said, "No bad days." She wore sneakers on her feet and shifted from side to side as a full-body ripple moved from her head to her toes. She was never good at hiding her feelings and was somehow as cute as he remembered, having hardly aged at all. In fact, she was prettier than ever. A ripple moved through him that had nothing to do with nerves. Ford couldn't help but stare. Her eyes grew wider. "Actually, I think you're supposed to ask how I'm doing, if you can get me anything to drink, or if I'm ready to place my order. Any of those would have been appropriate." His tone was light, joking. Her mouth opened and closed. Color rose to her cheeks. "You don't recognize?" Ford nodded and then gave into the smirk forming on his lips. "Of course I recognize you. Or you could have asked me where I've been, or what you're doing here." Her sweet voice was practically a whisper. "I'm here for the summer," he answered. "Me too." Her eyes danced over him, likely taking in the fact that his once athletic build had morphed into what the guys in his platoon referred to as being a tank. They had other names for him too, like the Beast, Scarface, and Captain America, among others. When Ford had enlisted, he went to Parris Island, South Carolina, and after 4 years moved up in rank to become Sergeant of Marines. He was in the Lima Company, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment. They were known as the cutting-edge unit that had consistently seen action since World War II. The unit was so finely honed it was said their fighting knives could cut a toothpick in half lengthwise. When the lieutenant was mortally wounded, he was assigned to take over the platoon and got a field-grade commission as second lieutenant. When he got out, he was captain but went into the reserves acting as major of Marines. The men were like brothers, his family, but never had he felt so at home as he did right then, seeing Eisley. Ford got to his feet and the chair clattered. He wrapped her in a hug. Amidst all the uncertainty, the upheaval, and the straight-up insanity of the last weeks of his life, Eisley, the most solid, loyal, and level-headed person he'd ever known, had appeared. He was quite certain God existed. Even amidst the horror of war, he felt especially like someone was shining down a ray of sunlight on him, and it had nothing to do with the Florida weather. Gratitude washed over him, and he hoped he Okay, that was such a rude interruption. Hi, everybody. Anyway, okay, back to where we were. Gratitude washed over him, and he hoped he passed it to her because he wasn't sure he'd be able to find the words to express the way he felt. That wasn't his strong suit. She felt smaller in his arms than he remembered her, or maybe he was bigger. His biceps were nearly the size of her head as he gripped her tight, holding fast like she was an anchor in the stormiest sea. Weather worse than any war he'd fought in. Well, almost. "Ford, you're crushing me," she choked out. He stepped back. "Sorry, this is such a surprise." She stood there, order pad in hand, as her expression spanned the spectrum from wide-eyed and shocked to smiling and full of glee like the Eisley he'd always known. Then she closed down with a scowl, an expression he'd never seen before. "What were you saying about a date?" Not that he was in the market. No, his life had just become supremely complicated, and women would be out of the picture for a long time. But Eisley wasn't just any woman. They'd been best friends since 3rd grade when he'd moved to town. They'd fallen out of touch in recent years. Well, to be precise, he'd distanced himself when feelings he knew better than to disclose overwhelmed him. She started laughing. That was something he hadn't done for months, maybe years, but her laugh was welcome. It was the sound of freedom ringing in his ears, reminding him of home. She turned to the restaurant counter, then back to him. She cupped her hand over the side of her mouth and called, "Is this some kind of setup like one of those reunion shows? Mom, you can come out now," she shouted. The restaurant had slowed for the evening, and Ford tugged her down to the empty chair beside him. What are you talking about? His mind was already wreathed in so much uncertainty, an entirely foreign feeling when he'd been fully trained to be in command at all times. At the moment, he was fully confused. "I don't understand." "Isn't this some kind of joke?" Eisley asked. "No, I just came to grab dinner. I wanted to surf and turf. A glass of soda and a nice view. I had no idea you'd be here." Her eyes flicked from him to the slivers of orange and yellow reflected off the glassy water as the last drops of sun faded. "Maybe it's fate," he shrugged. She got to her feet and scribbled down his order. "What kind of soda do you want, sir?" A crease formed between his eyebrows. "Are you mad?" "I thought we were friends. Best friends." Sadness pinched her eyes as though his past wrongdoing caught up to her. "We should talk. So much has changed. I don't even know where to begin." Before arriving in Blue Bay Beach, Ford had received one piece of life-changing news and then a second. He had hardly processed either, which was partly what brought him to the small town. He needed to land, to regroup and to figure things out, but whether it was fate or providence, he'd just been thrown another curveball. He wasn't looking to date or even be in a relationship, but he had a friendship to repair. He just wasn't sure how. He and Eisley had met during lunchtime at the Little Brick Elementary School in New Jersey. It was a zoo, and the cafeteria monitors were chatting in the corner. A kid named Willie Lingberry teased her about the Greek food in her lunchbox. She was on the brink of tears and locked eyes with Ford. As though strengthened by that brief connection, instead of succumbing to sadness and embarrassment, she turned to Willie. "I dare you to try it." Willie made all kinds of grossed-out noises. Ford stepped up. "I'll do it." Eisley gave him a bite of what looked like a very small burrito wrapped in a green leaf and stuffed with rice and cheese. She called it a dolmade. It was delicious. He shared his Cheetos with her, and they became inseparable for the next 10 years. Then things had changed after prom. She got busy with college stuff, and he prepared to enlist in the Marines. They hadn't seen each other or spoken since graduation day. "We should talk," she echoed his comment. "How about when you never went home for holidays or leave or whatever you call it? What about never returning my letters or calling or—" She cuts herself off. A guy with a sunburn and with his shirt unbuttoned one too many times sauntered over. "I heard her ask you on a date." "If not, I'd certainly be interested." He leered at Eisley. Ford's muscles tensed, and he forced down the growl in his throat. Okay. One more chapter?